Okay, let's start our second keynote speech. And I'm Zhiting Yang from Academia Sinica, and it's my great honor to chair this keynote speech. And we are very happy to invite Professor Douglas Elliman from Columbia University as our keynote speaker. And I believe many conference participants have ever read Professor Elliman's paper, including me, and I really enjoy reading his paper. His work is very influential and inspire a lot of researchers work in the field about the long-term impact of the childhood circumstance. And today's keynote speech also related to this topic. And we will have 15 minutes lecture, and Professor Elliman will take the questions in the last 10 minutes. So 50 lecture and 10 minutes Q&A. So let's welcome Professor Elliman.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This is joint work with Janet Curry, who's at Princeton, and Valentina Duke, who's at University of Michigan. And the question we're trying to answer today is basically, why does the academic literature on fetal origins, developmental origins, remain active today? So I think to most people in this room, outside of economics, to other branches in social science and in the popular press, people are familiar with the idea that the 9 months in utero are probably the most influential period in many people's lives, and there are persistent effects of in utero experiences that are very large in magnitude. So if we look over time at the academic literature on fetal origins in economics, I'll note a couple of things. The first is the literature has been going on for some time. You see in the 1990s, there are papers that are published either in top 5 journals or in leading field journals that reference fetal origins. And what happens maybe around 2005 or 2006 is something like a trend break. And so the activity in this literature has become even more frequent. And my personal view on why there's this trend break around 2005, 2006 is it's when people started taking, the identification strategies that are popular in labor economics and applying them to the fetal origins hypothesis. So papers by Hoyt-Bleakley, by Gerard Vandenberg, my paper on the flu, they're all from around 2005, 2006, when you see this inflection and more papers being written. And what I'm going to try and address today is why is it that this literature really seems to have legs and continued interest. To underscore this point about sort of continued interest and activity, this is sort of projecting forward a bit and looking, and this was off the top of my head, I'm sure I'm going to omit papers here as well, that are forthcoming or are on R&R at top 5 journals, and these include a paper by Eisen on air pollution in the United States and long-run effects, several papers by Maya Rosen, including one on stress that's forthcoming in the AER. Peter Nilsson has a paper on an alcohol liberalization policy in Sweden and long-run effects. There's a paper by Brown and co-authors that's R&R at the AER on the long-run effects of Medicaid, and on from there. You can go down the list. And so, a puzzle is that given that this idea is not that new of an idea, we still have, papers publishing in the top journals for something that's not that novel. So why is it the case that this persists when the proof of concept has been established? I think it continues for maybe 4 reasons. One is impact estimates are often very big. If you've gone to fetal origins talk, it often sort of ends with somebody asking, why are these magnitudes so big? And I think authors are sort of left in this position to say, well, how could something that's so brief have large long-term effects? And I think that, for economists, has sustained interest in this topic, and the fact that it's replicated across different early childhood exposures lends confidence to there being something real here. And I'll come back to that when I talk about the quality of the empirical evidence. And a nice feature of specifically the fetal origins hypothesis is that I think it lends itself to severe or refutable hypothesis testing, is that you have this clear definition of treatment and control groups, and when you combine that with a natural experiment, you have very sharp predictions for what later life cohort effects should look like. And so it lends itself to severe hypothesis testing to show, it predicts patterns that wouldn't sort of be likely to occur for other reasons. Thirdly, I would say there's been a development of synergies between this topic of fetal origins and various subfields in economics, including program evaluation, public finance and inequality, the formal modeling of capacity formation, family economics, development economics, and something that's been particularly useful in this literature is the growing use of administrative data sets, because we're going to be leveraging these natural experiments where we're going to be throwing out most of the variation in the data set and focus on that part that we think is exogenous, and then we need to sort of track these cohorts over time. So administrative data sets are going to be particularly useful. And then finally is just taking a step back, I think economists like this topic because it resonates with the idea of economic efficiency and optimal allocation of resources, that we can improve outcomes by changing the timing of investments. And while many of our investments, both in schooling and in healthcare, are sort of the pound of cure type of investments, the ounce of prevention that happens very early in life can yield very high returns. And it's sort of more nuanced than the usual optimal allocation of resources, because you're talking about wide separation in time and also across people, like investing in the mom and having impacts on her child. So I think it's sort of a sort of subtle spin on the usual optimal allocation of resources that's of interest to economists. Okay, so what am I going to talk about with the rest of this talk? I'm going to talk about what do I think economists have added to this literature, and where does it seem that the fetal origins research is heading. And I'll sort of give a brief summary of that here. I think it's moving to consider milder early life treatments and public policies. I think it's filling in some of the missing middle years. Many of the early papers would look at something that happened in utero or very early in childhood and then sort of do a time warp 40, 50, 60 years later and say, aha, there's something going on 60 years later. And recent studies have been using data from adolescence and test scores and that sort of thing to fill in those missing middle years. And so the progression of the literature to both milder treatments and policy and the missing middle years, I think, is still primarily a reduced form literature. But there are also aspects that are a bit more informed by theory. The first in point C is remediation, which is closely related to the very hot topic of dynamic complementarity in this literature. And then also thinking about behavioral responses and investment decisions. So what do parents do when they're greeted with a higher or exogenously higher or lower capacity or higher or lower health status child? Do they compensate with their investments, or do they reinforce? And we know surprisingly little about how parents respond to endowment differences across kids, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. Okay, so the fetal origins hypothesis, I have like one slide on this, so this is just going to be sort of short and sort of arbitrary. Perhaps you can think of it as a period where the foundation on which the rest of childhood is built is laid. Seckel refers to the action of a factor during a sensitive period or window of development that exerts organizational effects that persist throughout life. So this idea of persistence is central to this literature. An example frequently given is for hypertension. Kidney's functional unit is the nephron, and the number of nephrons responds very strongly to the prenatal environment, but doesn't change so much in the postnatal period. So that's determined very early on, and it shapes hypertension. And therefore, we see, particularly in chronic health conditions of adulthood, large responses to the prenatal and early childhood period. The initial evidence for this hypothesis, initial epidemiological evidence, because there was some lab evidence that preceded the Dutch famine evidence, were studies in the 1970s and 1980s of the Dutch famine. And the Dutch famine, I think, gets a lot of attention for a couple of reasons. One is famines don't usually happen in places with good data, and this was an example of a famine that happened in a place with a good data. Additionally, it was as famines go, it was a fairly short and fairly unexpected famine. And so for those reasons, epidemiologists and people in biomedicine have studied it and found that depriving children of nutrition during particularly the first and second trimesters of pregnancy has persistent effects in adulthood. Interestingly, when they looked at human capital of like military conscripts, I guess, they didn't find much at that age, but then when they got older, they started to find large long-term effects. So what does economics have to contribute to this literature? Well, I think the now familiar point that it's not just about famines. Other things that happen in utero are very important for later life outcomes. It's not just health outcomes that are being affected. Sort of the full gamut of things economists like to look at as endpoints seem to be affected. And I think thirdly is bringing more convincing empirical evidence to the question. Okay, so on the first point, it's not just about famine in utero. I think, certainly at this point, with hindsight, famine's long-term effects are pretty plausible. And more generally, if you think of an experience that's severe enough, it's probably not so surprising that there'd be long-term effects, whether it's in the in utero period or even later in life. And economists have moved from thinking about these nutritional experiences to other things like the disease environment, including malaria and influenza, but a whole host of things which I'm not going to list here, but including ionizing radiation, temperature, income, which is obviously pretty policy relevant. And so I think something economists have added to this literature is the whole host of things that shape the prenatal environment have long-term signatures. Secondly, economists were very happy to look at things other than health outcomes. So educational attainment, wages and income, the kind of neighborhood you live in, whether you get married and the type of your spouse, lots of other things other than health are affected. So you don't have to be like a health economist to think this is an interesting literature. And then thirdly, I think, is sort of the quality of the empirical evidence. I think, at first pass, fetal origins kind of sounds like astrology, and I think there is indeed, if I may be mean about the epidemiological literature, there's a lot of astrology caliber research, out there that really should not be believed. And I think what economists have done, and this is sort of harnessing the identification strategy bandwagon, is couple this hypothesis that, strictly speaking, if you're immediately postnatal, you're not as affected as if you're in utero when something traumatic happens, to have this sharp definition of treatment and control groups that has these severe predictions for later life outcomes, and that combines very well with natural experiments. So I show this figure from Sweden in 1986, which is gamma radiation by month, and the darker line is for 1986. And what you see, and it was the first recognition that something was going on outside of the Soviet Union, was a couple of days after the meltdown in Ukraine, radiation levels spiked in Sweden because the plume blew to the northwest. And because Sweden has such wonderful data, we can look at the cohorts that happen to be in utero when this spike in radiation levels occurred, and even more so than the fetal period being particularly sensitive to environmental influences. The work that was referenced yesterday on the U.S. atomic bomb drops on Japan has found that particularly between weeks 8 and 25 of gestation, neural development is especially radiosensitive. So when cells are dividing and differentiating, that is particularly sensitive to even low levels of ionizing radiation. So if you happen to be in Sweden and you were already conceived, so there's no like endogenous conception response or anything like that, do we see for that very narrowly defined cohort that experienced this spike, when we fast forward 15 years and look at their IQ and that sort of thing, do they look different? And the answer is yes, indeed they do. And we can make these very narrow cohort comparisons, and we can layer on top of those very narrow cohort comparisons the geographic variation and fallout that came about by the fact that if in the day or two that plume was hovering over Sweden, if it rained, you got much higher fallout levels. So some of the highest fallout levels in Europe were in Sweden, in areas where it just happened to rain a lot when that plume was overhead. So yes, this idea that certain ages are affected more than others is very useful for the empirical analyses that have occurred. And the magnitude of the effects that we found for Chernobyl we argue are very comparable to much more protracted educational interventions that occur later in life. So I've sort of focused maybe a bit too much on the fetal period. This is a paper from 2013 that really moved my priors on the influence of the postnatal period, and what they're leveraging in Chile and Norway was this fact that hospitals really get very excited when a baby is born below 1,500 grams. So that's very low birth weight. And an infant that's born below 1,500 grams stays substantially longer in the hospital and receives a whole host of additional treatments, among which may be surfactant, which helps the low birth weight infant breathe. And then in the data that they have for Chile and Norway, they look at a bunch of outcomes later in life and show that this, brief, because we're talking about something like 6 days longer in the hospital, has this same jump at the 1,500 gram threshold when these cohorts are observed later in life. So, a way in which this literature has progressed, in addition to the ways I've already mentioned, is also to take it outside of the fetal period and consider identification strategies that identify the effect of interventions in the postnatal period as well. Okay, so I'm appointed in the Department of Economics, but I'm also appointed in the School of Public Policy. And so a question I'm interested in is, what are the policy implications of a fetal origins perspective? And something that, is kind of obvious if you think about it is, it's not very informative to say, well, gosh, the flu cohorts aren't doing very well later in life. We really shouldn't have had a flu pandemic, or famines are very bad. We already knew those things, right? They're not going to pass cost-benefit analysis regardless of whether we consider the fetal origins perspective. So the fetal origins perspective just makes the rubble bounce. So it's not going to be pivotal for cost-benefit calculations when there are these big mortality effects. And so I think in general, apart from certain targeted things like, okay, maybe during a famine or during a Fukushima or whatever, you should think especially hard about protecting women who are pregnant from the event. There are limited policy implications of especially severe experiences in natural experiments. But I think, in sort of the arc of this literature, it was useful to start with these severe things, because it was more plausible that these things had long-term effects, and then over time we've moved to things that are less severe. But I should acknowledge that there's some hypocrisy here, because I've written papers on famine and flu and these things that killed a lot of people, so that the literature cut its teeth on these things, and I'm not saying that it's the case that we don't learn lots of cool things by looking at high mortality events. I think we saw one this morning on the typhoons in the Philippines that was doing a much better job than people usually do on thinking about the selection effects of an early life shock versus the scarring effects of an early life shock, and in effect having maybe instrument's too strong a word, but an instrument for both the mortality effect and for the inframarginal effect as well, and being able to try and disentangle those two pieces. So I think, papers that have a mortality component, probably need more of an extra wrinkle than they did, say, 10 years ago. And this is an example of a paper that has one. And in part, not just to be grumpy about that, but more because of just the sheer number of papers that we're writing this review for the Journal of Economic Literature, where we're going to basically skip the mass mortality events like civil wars, pandemics, and famines, just because there's so many things to review, but also for this reason that I just mentioned, that they're not going to be, the fetal origins perspective is not going to be so pivotal for the cost-benefit calculation. So where's the literature headed? Well, you probably guessed it. It's heading to milder treatments. And this is a situation where this perspective can be more influential for cost-benefit. And also, mild events and circumstances are more commonly experienced than extreme ones. So this is something that's, a more general phenomenon. I should note, though, that in that first slide or second slide I put up with the publications from the 1990s, many of those publications were considering less extreme events, like how does birth weight predict, test scores in England and that sort of thing. And those were not identified by starvation. They were considered by, sort of garden variety variation in birth weight and that sort of thing. But the problem with, that literature was that it was set up for omitted variables bias. And I think that early literature is viewed as descriptive, which isn't to say it wasn't useful. I think, there are sort of stages of this thing. There was the descriptive, suggestive literature, and then there are these, big traumatic events that had long-term effects, and now we're moving to sort of milder stuff that is experienced in everyday life. And the tension is to, preserve the quality of the identification strategy as we move to these things. So some examples of milder treatments. We saw one yesterday on prenatal Ramadan fasting. And that, is a fast that's for 1 lunar month. It's only for daylight hours. So that's, definitely a light touch relative to something like a famine. And still you see, non-trivial long-term effects of something like that. And then going down the list from here, variation in weather and temperature, U.S. air pollution levels, which are not, crazy high. That's a forthcoming JPE, maternal stress from bereavement, seasonal influenza. So that, I think is basically, much more scary than the findings regarding the 1918 influenza pandemic. Low-level ionizing radiation, and as mentioned, these are publishing well in top journals. This is the paper that I find particularly scary, which is analyzing data from Denmark, and it, I think it deploys best practice empirical methods, and it shows sibling comparisons. So when the mom is sick in one pregnancy and not sick in the other pregnancy, and finds, large impact estimates like a 9% reduction in earnings from seasonal influenza infections. So these light touches can have very large effects as well, and they generate. Hans generates some cool figures, which show that seasonal infections are maybe a big part of why we have seasonality in birth outcomes and long-run effects as well. This just shows in Denmark that flu activity tends to peak around March, and it's mirrored by gestation length. And the paper obviously digs into this much more, but one of the things I guess the biomedical folks say about gestation length is, when the mom is in trouble, the fetus worries, if you will, about how the mom is doing. And maybe if the mom is sufficiently sick, it's better for the fetus to get off the sinking ship and be born than to stay in utero. And so if the mom is sick with influenza, it can spur premature delivery. Okay, fetal origins and policy. So I just spoke about sort of milder treatments, and there's some overlap with policy. I think it's the case that relatively few studies are looking at the long-term effects of actual policies, and I don't think that's for lack of interest. I think it's the usual policy evaluation challenges plus the need for suitable longitudinal data. I think it's, can be challenging to implement, but it's particularly informative, particularly for policy. Examples exist, but are relatively recent. So we have a paper on the food stamps rollout in the 1960s and 1970s. There's a recent paper in the AER on the effect of means-tested cash transfers during childhood. We'll hear with the anchor keynote about deworming. And Adviru et al. Have a paper on Progressa, and then I mentioned this paper before about liberalization of alcohol sales policy in Sweden. But I think there's a need for additional studies that inform more directly policy. And I'll come to this a little bit later. A reason to have a reason why those studies are valuable beyond the obvious one is we don't really have such great measures of incipient fetal origins damage, if you will. And so we can't just look at birth weight and say no whether a policy is going to register long-term benefits or not. So let me summarize briefly this food stamps paper. This food stamps paper leveraged the county-by-county rollout of the modern food stamps program across U.S. counties during the 1960s and 1970s, and we followed up outcomes using the PSID in this geo-identified version that has the county on it. And what we find is that decades later, we still see positive persistent effects of the food stamps program, and the impact estimates are large, like a 0.4 standard deviation reduction in metabolic syndrome, which is sort of a summary measure of health, and an increase in economic self-sufficiency among women. And just to be a little pedantic, I don't think these effects observed in adulthood were necessarily a part of the intent of the original program. The part of the intent of the original program was just to reduce starvation and improve nutrition. To the extent that they were not considered, then maybe we were doing too little of that program. So Trump shouldn't be cutting it, which he probably will try and do anyways. Switching now to the missing middle years of the life cycle, I'm definitely guilty of this. My 1918 influenza paper started going 42 years later with the 1960 census, the 1970 census, the 1980 census. And I, from personal experience, I know that skipping, 40 years forward is kind of cool, but it definitely annoys education economists. It also seems kind of allergic to disentangling some mechanisms to sort of see how these things are playing out over time. Like, is it health that's compromising human capital formation, or is there a direct effect on cognition? So it sort of seems with the right data, we can learn more about pathways than by just sort of seeing presto, adult males in worse health and has lower educational attainment. That said, I think maybe some of the hesitance to looking at the missing middle years is it violates at least the spirit of the notion that damage would be latent. So some of the evolutionary argument heard to the adaptive value of cutting corners when things are tough in utero is that you would cut those corners in utero that would have consequences after that child reproduced. So once you reproduce, you're kind of expendable. And so those health conditions, those chronic health conditions that appear in the 40s and 50s, well, that's okay from an evolutionary perspective, so long as you had a chance to already reproduce. If that's the way it really goes, then we wouldn't really expect to see much until, the cohorts are in their 40s or something like that. That said, empirically, what do people find? People find that you could often find, in the teens that you see stuff that looks like fetal origins types effects. Bosch and I have written 2 papers on Ramadan. The first one did the time warp, from the prenatal period, forward to adulthood. And then our second paper in England looked at test scores at age 7 and found, impacts with a similar timing as the time warp ones. And other recent papers have done this as well to look at schooling outcomes. So I think this is a natural way that the fetal origins literature is engaging, economics of education is by looking at these outcomes and finding big impacts on those. And just to be explicit, I'm not referring to birth outcomes here, but these sort of developmental outcomes that are observed after birth. And again, longitudinal microdata are at a premium. Okay, so the weighting is the hardest part. Like we did in the food stamps paper, we waited till these guys became adults, and then we can say something informative about the food stamps program in the 1960s and 1970s, which isn't so informative for policy in the 1960s and 1970s to tell that now. Wouldn't it be useful if we had a metric that would tell us more quickly whether we're doing good things by way of future outcomes? Birth weight is the closest thing I think we have to a default metric, but it often gets things wrong. So I think gets the Dutch famine wrong. Like the first and second trimesters are the ones that show big long-term effects, but it's really the third trimester of famine exposure that shows the big birth weight drop. The title of the Chernobyl paper is Chernobyl's Subclinical Legacy, and it's titled that in part because we see Zippo on birth outcomes. There's no movement in birth outcomes, but there's obviously long-term effects of Chernobyl. So there's that issue. There's also the case that, if we're looking at postnatal treatments, obviously birth weight's not going to capture that either. So because we don't have a good D variable here, I think a lot of this literature has been content to sort of skip past D and go, what's the reduced form effect of Z, your natural experiment or instrument, on outcomes Y, be they in the missing middle years or later on. And that's maybe a safe thing to do, but it's also frustrating because how are we to compare one Z to another? Do I think the flu is worse than Chernobyl? Those are tough things to compare unless I can compare them along some dimension like birth weight. So we have these qualitative predictions, which isn't the most helpful. You might think that science measurement is going to come to the rescue. So with advances in measurement, maybe something that was kind of latent can become observable. So there's been lots of discussion about epigenetic markers, methylation patterns, telomere length, cortisol, precision medicine, et cetera. Maybe these will save the day. It would be super useful if they did, and then we wouldn't have to wait 40 years to see what are the true effects of this public policy or environmental experience. On the other hand, if you talk to epi folks for too long, you realize that they are, if anything, well, I'm sure they would say the opposite of us, but they're not here. You can get a little too excited about measurement over identification, and I think they would invest more in measurement, and we would invest more in identification. It'd be great to have both. The econometric criteria for a valid marker are kind of, I'm not going to go into it here, but they're tougher than your intuition might suggest. And one way to perhaps see that is just take seriously Heckman's multi-dimensional conception of capacity. If we have 2 dimensions of capacity, like cognitive capacity and health capacity, just arbitrarily, early life shocks are going to probably have more than shock to more than one dimension in general, and parental responses are going to be more than one general, and your capacity is going to be more than one dimension. So this looking for a unidimensional metric may just be a non-starter. There's not going to be just one thing that captures it. So I don't have an answer to this. This is just me being frustrated by, we'd rather not have to wait 40 years to see what's happening, but I don't know of a good marker that's picking it up. Okay, remediation. Can we fix bad early life trajectories with period 2 investments? This is tough to do empirically because of the usual, this is all from the applied micro side, I apologize, but it's tough enough to find one valid instrument. And if we're going to be thinking about remediation, I think we want to find 2 instruments. If we just tried to do it with one instrument, so say we looked at some prenatal insult, And then we saw that like parents responded to that prenatal insult. So say like prenatal influenza, the baby is less healthy, parents make compensatory postnatal investments, then we might want to think about, well, did those postnatal investments fix things or not? Those postnatal investments are endogenous to the prenatal insult, and because they're endogenous, it's problematic to include those on the right-hand side. So, if you're tempted to do that, please skip to, Angert-Pischke on endogenous control and realize that when you put that in on the right-hand side, you're introducing a bias that wouldn't otherwise be there. So again, it's another reason why we have to run home to like reduced form effects of influenza and famine, unless we have this wealth of two instruments to consider remediation. And something that Bosch and I say to be emotive, I guess, is kind of need for lightning to strike twice, to have prenatal natural experiment and a postnatal natural experiment that affects the same cohort, ideally. And that's, of course, again, going to require some huge data set like a population register. So when we were talking about this in a review paper we wrote in 2013, I think we were kind of pessimistic that people would ever be able to do this, and I have been sort of surprised and heartened to see that people actually have been able to find what I think are two credible lightning strikes to try and identify this thing, which I'll summarize briefly in a second. Theory is in quotes here, like David, this isn't theory to you, but this is theory to many of the reduced form folks. One of the coolest things I think Heckman did, and that's saying quite something, obviously, is take just a standard CES production function, which would often have capital and labor in there, and instead of doing that, just do periods of childhood. Okay, so think about I1 could be like prenatal investments, and I2 could be postnatal investments, and allowing for differing elasticity of substitutions between prenatal and postnatal investments. I think that's just so super cool, and when I saw it, it just blew my mind. I thought that was awesome. And it's helpful because what do people like me do? Janet and I talk about this in the handbook chapter. We think about a shock, and like a mu-G shock, and it's a G because the shocks that we analyze, like with Chernobyl or flu or whatever, are often at the group level. What's the effect of a mu-G shock on H? Okay, and even if we put bars over the eyes, so we're not allowing an investment response in the first period, we're not allowing an investment response in the second period. If you think CES isn't a bad way to think about developmental childhood, it's not like the elasticity of substitution just falls right out of this reduced form. Okay, so we don't know. It's consistent with a lot of stuff. We don't learn what the substitutability is. We can maybe get closer if we have two shocks. So like think of a mu-G prime shock in the second period of childhood, and then we could take the ratio of partial H mu-G prime to partial H u-G, and we're getting closer to saying something about the elasticity of substitution. But it's going to depend. It's going to depend on the magnitude of first period investments relative to second investments, and sort of you can read the text here, whether high elasticities of substitution or low elasticities of substitution are going to lead to the more effectiveness of remediation. So this leads to this other point, which is it's really tough to know a priori whether remediation is going to be effective. And I think some people have in mind that fetal origins means things are fated, but I think if you just think about a CES production function, you don't really know how fated things are and whether investments in the second period can fix damage or not. So we can't. I don't think from my sort of dogmatic point of view, I don't think we should give up. But also, I don't think from this conceptual point of view, we can't automatically give up on prenatally damaged cohorts. Dynamic complementarity. So that's a very hot area within fetal origins, and Heckman defines it this way, and I'll just say it quickly in words. It's like whether the return to investments is higher for people with a higher stock of that capacity. So maybe the returns to educational investment are higher at later stage of child's life cycle for more able or more healthy or more motivated kids. So skills beget skills is sort of the quote people sometimes use for thinking about dynamic complementarities. And Heckman thinks dynamic complementarities are probably positive greater than 0. What's the state of play in dynamic complementarities? Well, there's a R&R at the JPE by Anna Iser and Flavio Cunha that finds strong evidence of complementarity between investments and early human capital, looking at Head Start expansion in the United States. I'll implicate Bosch here. Bosch and I are somewhat cranky about this because we think it's only one lightning strike, not 2 lightning strikes. And when you have just the one lightning strike, I think many of the usual concerns about omitted variables bias and, you know, kitchen sink regression strategies sort of come into play. So how do we get at this? Well, we have to get very lucky by finding these 2 lightning strikes, which I think people have actually managed to do, or just have a lot of money and do some sort of randomization where you have multiple arms and can tease out the production technology. I think the instruments in the observational studies that have been analyzed are kind of serendipitous, and in that respect, I think it's kind of like a throwback to the literature from 2005, 2006, when people are looking at wacky things like hookworm eradication and flu pandemics, but maybe a collection of these lights is going to be informative about what the production technology is, because that would be very helpful to know. So just a couple of quick examples on dynamic complementarities. Rose and Slater and co-author, who I can't pronounce, have a paper from Denmark that looks at the interaction of a nurse home visiting program shortly after birth and childcare at age 3 in Denmark, and the rollout of that. I'm running out of time, so let me sort of just skip to the result to say is they find, rather than there being a complementarity, that there seems to be, that they act as substitutes. And other papers have sort of found something similar. This paper in Bangladesh that was looking at a vitamin supplementation that was a randomization happened to interact with like a tornado that came in, and these folks actually, interestingly, don't use the word dynamic complementarity anywhere in the paper, but I think if they found something different, they might have. So they say that maybe they're not complements, maybe they're substitutes. So, but I think it's too early to say whether dynamic complementarities consistently exist or not. What I will say is that it seems feasible with a design-based approach to get some traction on these. Or is, okay, here was, I said, or is it? Dun, dun, dun. A paper I'd encourage you to read is by my colleagues Kiki, Miguel, and Ofer, which is looking for evidence of dynamic complementarities. And something they point out in this paper is it may be even tougher than we've suggested. Of even if you have 2 instruments, if you have parental responsive behavior going on in between these 2 things, we may not be coming up with that, the parameters of the production function as we hoped. Okay, so I'm going to close with responsive investments. Here are our 4 kids. Why do I have a picture of our 4 kids? I think I have a picture of 4 kids because these kids are they may look kind of alike, but they're really different from each other, and I personally don't know how my investments respond to those differences. All I know is that they do somehow. And I think depending on the dimension, I may compensate some dimensions and I may reinforce other dimensions. And I think this sort of ignorance of what parents do in response to endowment differences across their kids is true in the literature as well. And I think economists have become economists maybe were always interested, but the reduced form folks more recently have become interested in the behavioral responses to endowment differences across kids. So note, as I stated before, if investments are held fixed, so there's no responsive investments, then we're getting something like the biological effect. And I think we've often assumed that what we're getting is the biological effect. But to the extent that we have a fairly complementary production function, and I should distinguish, when I say a complementary production function, that is not the same thing as saying dynamic complementarity. Those are different concepts. I'm just talking about the exponent and the CES production function. If early and late childhood are strong complements, then there are going to be strong forces leading us to want to respond with our behavior. And I think this answers a call long ago by Heckman and by Ed Glazer when I presented my flu paper, and he said, I'd really like to have some behavior in there, and I was like, well, there's not behavior, but I think that helps with the identification. Heckman said, economics has sunk to like a New Yorker article, which I think he meant as an insult, but I actually really like the New Yorker. But I think behavioral responses are not just like navel-gazing by economists. I think they are large in magnitude, and they can have big effects on later life outcomes. So I'm going to sort of close by talking a little bit about behavioral responses for expositional purposes. I'm going to consider it like a negative mu-G. So something bad happens in the first period of childhood, and responses can either attenuate or accentuate that initial damage. A point that's been made in other contexts, but it's relevant here, is unless the investment response is costless, damage estimates which monetize partial H, partial mu-G will tend to understate the total damage. So you can imagine in the extreme, investment responses that fully offset early life shock would mean that such shocks are not observed in their effects on H, but we need to include the cost of those responses. And more generally, the damage from early life shocks can tend to be understated if we're ignoring the compensatory investments. And I think many economists have in mind that parents probably do compensatory responses. But even when the response is reinforcing, negative shocks have costs for both the children and parents. Empirical evidence, there does seem to be interesting responsive behavior. I'll note, as an aside, that when we do family fixed effects, we're accentuating the role of those investment responses. So, some of the early papers in the literature were not using what would be called an identification strategy. They were just having a control strategy where they put in the mom fixed effect, and that would tend to accentuate behavioral responses within the family. So if you thought they were compensatory, then we'd be winding up from those studies with overestimates of the biological effect of fetal origins, period. But the literature has sort of moved to the natural experiments. Okay, so just briefly, assume like really boring parental preferences, like Cobb-Douglas or something like that, over H, which is child quality, and C, which is consumption. The production function, as before, is more interesting, CES. And then let's consider a couple special cases of the CES production function. You think about the perfect substitutability case, which reduces to this linear production technology of here. If you just do a simple like undergrad optimization here, your optimized second period investments are going to go in the opposite direction as the shock. So this says that when you have a production technology like this one here, you should compensate. And so you fix damage if mu-G is less than 0. The flip side that people don't talk about is if mu-G is greater than 0, so like something good that happens in the prenatal period, well, you should have a party and consume more and invest less in your kids. So this is like a testable thing, which I don't know how to test, but it would be cool if one could test it. Consider the polar opposite production technology that's Leontief. With a Leontief production technology, then it's the opposite. The optimal second period investments go in the same direction as the shock. Okay, and the reason for this is the return to fighting what happened in the first period is just really low because you can't do any better than whatever bad thing you did during the first period. So for a wide class of parental preferences, you can be a very loving, wonderful parent, but you don't like hitting your head against the wall, right? And so you would tend to reinforce shocks. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about the fetal origins literature is if you think what fetal origins or developmental origins, if you take it out of the fetal period, is telling us that there is strong complementarity across stages of childhood, then these incentives for parents to reinforce endowment differences is strong. So if that's the case, is it indeed that we see that parents sometimes reinforce endowment differences? And so this paper from 2013 with Bosch summarized some of the evidence on parental responses to, well, I guess we're trying to do all of the evidence at that point, but it's a little dated now. And we categorize these as within family estimates or design-based. And we found some evidence of compensation, but we also found many situations where parents seem to reinforce endowment differences across kids. And again, this is not, in my view, driven by the preferences so much as driven by a production technology that's consistent with fetal origins. And then there have been recent papers since then looking at investment responses, many more than listed here. But Iser and Kuna find reinforcement in their paper. Dizan Ross has some cool experimental papers where finding reinforcement. But the upshot is, I've changed my mind. I think responsive behavior is really empirically important, and more often than you might think, it reinforces damage, though not all the time, and I think that's consistent with a complementary production function. No one asked me if there was going to be an Act 3 of the fetal origins literature, and I really don't know if there will be, but if I had to guess what it would be, I would say learning about what informs parental investment decisions, I think, is a really cool and new area to think about. So Flavia Cunha is doing some work on that, as is Rebecca Dizon Ross at Chicago, and I'm sure I've omitted other people here, and in general in this talk, I'm sure I've omitted a lot of papers that I should have referenced, but I tried to talk really quickly. Okay, so summary and conclusion. Fetal origins effects are large. They're often substantially larger than the effects of longer, more costly interventions occurring later in childhood. And as I mentioned, authors often have to defend these big effects, which isn't the worst position to be in. And I think we have this opportunity to improve outcomes at zero cost by reallocating resources, by doing ounce of prevention instead of pound of cure. I think this resonates with what we think of as economics. And I think fetal origins has thrived in part because it's engaged other subfields of economics. And I think the literature should and does have a vibrant second act. So that's it. Thank you very much.
I wanted to push back a little bit on the argument that you made towards the beginning that age allows us to distinguish between treatment and control groups or exposed and unexposed cohorts, and that's an advantage of these types of studies. It seems to me that, for one thing, that there's a lot of uncertainty scientifically about the timing at which certain health shocks or insults affect health outcomes. So this made me think of schizophrenia in particular, which is thought to be caused by viral infection in utero, interacted with particular genetic susceptibility, but beyond that, I don't think they're particularly clear on what's the timing at which this happens or what are the genes that are important. And that's just one pathway, but then when we take it to economic outcomes, we're combining that with multiple different pathways, different health outcomes leading to different economic outcomes. And so that seems like, for one, there's a lot of uncertainty, but also that these are kind of continuous processes where it's hard to distinguish between week 16 and week 17 of gestation, for instance. And so I guess the question is whether you think first that science is a serious limitation to moving forward in this field, that we just don't know exactly how the biological processes work, and also whether there are settings in which you think that age works particularly well in terms of distinguishing between treatment and control versus settings where it's really hard to cut in that way.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I think, so if you take an example like ionizing radiation, I think that's a situation where within pregnancy, we know, in part from the observational evidence, but also from animal models, that the specific period within pregnancy that matters. I think for many of the things economists have looked at, I don't think they've always had to take such a strong stand on when within pregnancy it matters, and have often compared pregnancy versus age 1 or something like that. And so that's been a bit agnostic about what exactly the timing within pregnancy that really matters. In terms of whether, how much science can guide us on this, something that is maybe, a bit too cynical is I became increasingly suspicious of like mechanisms and pathways from science, because it sort of seemed like, at least from some of the work in the fetal origins literature, is for any epidemiological correlation, there was some fancy sounding pathway which I think followed the epidemiological correlation. And so what I think is potentially more useful, or particularly as a layperson who can't digest that evidence as well as a physician or something like that, is the animal models are much more useful for thinking about what timing really matters, and can we extrapolate from animal models to humans and think about when matters the most. But I think you're right in that specific things like ionizing radiation we have a good sense of, but other things, potentially schizophrenia, we have less of a sense of exactly when should matter. And to that extent, we don't have the full precision of timing unless you're willing to take a step back and say, I'm just going to do like fetal versus postnatal period or something like that, which like in my own case, I've been often, happy to just do that. Yeah.
So the dynamic
Complementarity.
options by parents later on for any remediation effects of the prenatal exposure, this is largely depends on the knowledge or information of the potentially know in the future there will be effect, but like a lot of the researchers you listed here, possibly if we never saw the research from the scientific study, we don't even know that like after 40 or 50 years, will be affecting the IQ or test scores. So I wonder how this information or thing can be involved in the...
Okay, let me see if I understood the question, but like taking Chernobyl fallout in Sweden, maybe people just didn't know that was bad, and so why would you respond with your investments? Why would you reinforce? I think you would potentially reinforce even if you knew nothing about Chernobyl, because you have observations on your kids' health and you have observations on your kids' cognitive capacity. So even if you have no idea why they are more or less able, you still respond to it, even though if you don't know why it is the way it is. Was that your question? Or no?
So like for the radiation is more, it's such a big event, or even though there is like the parents observe there is a change in IQ or a difference with peer children, but the specific intervention, like should they do remediation targeting at radiation or just a general substitution, like investing on education, general investments. So I wonder, like the knowledge will make a difference of what types of investment.
Right. So yeah, I think for there to be like an important optimized response that's correlated to the endowment, I don't think you have to know the production technology to do it or know why they're different. You sort of, just by your own experience, you sort of figure out what the endowment is and sort of what's the return to your investments. But I think where your question is coming from is exactly right, is figuring out what parents know and what shapes their investments. That's like if we knew that better, I think we could make a lot of progress. And my sense is we don't have a great sense of that. Like, for example, with this diffusion of fetal origins research, have parents' investments changed that much? Like, I don't really have a sense. I mean, and you know, take it back to like the 1950s when it was like the fetus was the perfect parasite, right? And it would, you know, the mom would buffer any bad thing that happened. So like smoking and drinking, I'm putting it rather extreme, but there was a very different view about the effect of maternal behaviors on fetal health and lung effects then than there is now. And I think some behaviors have changed and maybe others haven't.
Thank you. So I'm thinking of the empirical evidence of the dynamic complementarity. So when we for example, when we evaluate a causal impact of a program, and we often check the heterogeneity, right? And for example, if we divide our samples into two groups according to their socioeconomic background, then children made from socioeconomic disadvantaged families. For this group of children, if our policy may have stronger effects on this group, then does it support for the dynamic complementarity?
So, I think that's suggestive, but I guess, you know, I'm worried about the balance test. Like, what else is correlated with that stratification besides what you stratified by? And how do I know it's not the other thing as opposed to the thing you stratified by? So I think it gets us in that direction. It's consistent with it, but I don't know if it's like compelling, if I understood the question correctly.
So I mean, if the intervention is kind of random or exogenous,
yep.
And people get treated or untreated, does not depend on their family background.
Yep.
Then
and then I stratify by family background.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So when you stratify by family background, like, everything's going to be different along those dimensions. And so say we're thinking about like some sort of health investment or something like that, and I stratify by family background, and you know, cognitive ability is going to be different by stratifications of family background. I think I have a very different view about the interaction between cognition and health, and say health and health or something like that. So I guess I just don't know how to interpret it when everything is being moved with that stratification. Yeah. That's not the best example, but